Okay, so you know how like everybody's always talking about website cookies,
Right.
right?
Uh-huh.
And how they're supposed to like improve our online experience and all that jazz.
Yeah, yeah. Remembering our preferences and, all those targeted ads that seem to follow you everywhere you go online.
Exactly. They promise to make everything so smooth and personalized. But it's funny, right? I mean, the word cookie used to be something you dunked in milk, and now it's this invisible thing tracking all our clicks.
It's true. It's a huge shift, isn't it? The way the meaning of cookie has changed, and not just the meaning, but also how it functions, right?
Right.
It reminds me of this book, Existenzformen der Sprache. Have you ever heard of it?
I'm not, no.
It basically talks about how language evolves, and a big part of that is how the function of a word can change so drastically over time,
Yeah.
even faster than the word itself.
That's so interesting, and it really got me thinking. If the function of a word can change so much moving forward in time, what about if we look backward? Like, could we recontextualize a word or a concept from today and apply it to the past?
Hmm, that's a really interesting thought.
Could something from centuries ago have a purpose that we recognize now, even if it looks completely different? And this is where it gets kind of wild. I was listening to a lecture, totally different subject, about 15th century Dutch drawings from the Hermitage Museum.
Wow, 15th century drawings and digital cookies. That's quite a leap.
I know, right? But hear me out. What if we, and I say this with all due respect, what if we imagine these drawings as the cookies of their time? They hold information. They serve a purpose beyond just being art. In fact, the lecturer, an art historian named Larionov, even said that artwork doesn't fully capture their significance because of all the information packed into them. And get this, he started by talking about two copies of a depiction of the Annunciation, both made in the 15th century.
So right away you have this idea of a copy, which has such a different meaning for us today. We think of mass production, digital files, backups.
Right. But in the 15th century, before printing was widespread, and you couldn't just hop on a plane to see an original painting, a copy served a totally different purpose.
Absolutely. As the lecturer explained, copies were vital back then for spreading artistic ideas, for documenting compositions, even for planning larger artworks. They were absolutely crucial to the artistic and intellectual life of the time.
Okay, so let's get specific. Lorionov went on to talk about Copies of the Crucifixion by Rogier van der Weyden, a big name in 15th century art, and a copy of part of another work that hasn't survived.
Right.
What jumped out at him when he looked at these copies?
Well, one of the first things you notice is how the figures in the lower part of the crucifixion copies are depicted kind of schematically.
Uh-huh.
There's not a lot of emphasis on individual facial expressions or really detailed forms. But then when you look at the clothing in those same drawings, the level of detail is amazing. It's super precise and meticulous.
Now, this is where the cookie analogy gets really interesting. What he noticed about the clothing actually ties in with what we know about artistic practices back then. Apparently, the overall composition of a painting was often very strict, sometimes even dictated by whoever commissioned it or by religious institutions.
I see. So there wasn't much freedom for artists to play around with the basic layout.
Exactly. But the way they depicted clothing, that seems to have been where they could express themselves, where they could really show off their observational skills.
Makes sense.
They could really focus on the folds and the textures and the styles of the time.
So going back to the cookie idea, one piece of information we get is this intense interest that the artist had in capturing the nuances of contemporary fashion. These drawings tell us what aspects of the world they were really paying attention to and what they felt was important enough to document in such detail. Obviously, we can't travel back in time and hand these 15th century artists modern fashion sketches to compare.
I wish. But even though we can't do that, the insight we do gain is still so valuable. It tells us so much about what they saw and what they thought was worth recording carefully.
Absolutely. It speaks volumes about their observational skills and how they decided what was worthy of detailed representation.
And it's not just about the subject matter, is it? Larionov pointed out how even the technical details of the drawings act like cookie information.
Right, right. Like the color of the drawings, for example.
Yeah.
That's where we find another layer of hidden information. The subtle variations in the shade of the paper and the ink actually reveal what kind of ink was used. Remember, back then, ink was often made from soot, the stuff you get from fireplaces or oil lamps.
Right.
And depending on where in the chimney they collected the soot, the color would change. It could be light, almost yellowish, or deep black. So just by looking at the ink color, we can figure out details about what materials were available and maybe even the environment where the drawing was made.
That's incredible. You're basically reading between the lines or even within the lines themselves. Now, the lecture didn't just focus on copies. It also talked about original drawings, which provide a whole different set of insights into the 15th century. One that stood out was an original drawing by an unknown artist, described as a very early form of calligraphic drawing. What does that even mean?
Well, this drawing was incredibly structured and detailed. It showed a hierarchy of society at the time, starting with the Pope and Charlemagne at the top,
Right.
then the nobility, the clergy, the burghers, and even down to the artisans. It's such a fascinating glimpse into how they viewed the social order, all carefully laid out. And what's really cool is that art historians can recognize a specific handwriting, a unique style, even in these drawings that are mostly informational.
So this one drawing is like a visual database of the entire social structure.
Yeah.
That's an insane amount of information packed into one sheet of paper. Then there were the planning drawings, not copies, but preliminary sketches for the altarpiece of the Virgin Mary in Laredo, Spain, and for a misericord.
Yes.
By the way, for anyone who doesn't know, a misericord is that little shelf on a choir stall that gives you something to lean on if you're standing for a long time.
Exactly. And these planning drawings are like a window into the artist's mind. You can see what they wanted to show in the finished piece, what we might call the revealed information, but also the hidden information, like how they were playing with the composition, the details of the figures, their early ideas about materials and techniques.
So it's like stepping into their workshop and watching them work.
Precisely. And by studying these sketches, we can learn so much about crafts and tools and even the clothes people wore back then.
Wow. And the fact that these drawings were kept loose on simple paper until much later, not framed or anything, says something about how they were seen initially, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The fact that they were just independent pieces until the 18th century, when collectors started framing them and adding them to their collections, suggests that their main value wasn't as art objects in the modern sense. They were more about the practical information they contained, ideas to be developed, records to be kept. It's pretty amazing that any of these drawings have survived at all. I mean, they're so fragile.
Right. And that's another thing that struck me in the lecture. Larionov talked about how there are about 600 15th century Dutch drawings that still exist worldwide.
Oh, wow.
28 of them are in the Hermitage Museum. He actually called it a violation of probability theory that so many survived. Why is that so surprising?
Well, think about the Netherlands in the 15th century and even later. There were so many conflicts, civil wars, religious wars, the long fight for independence from Spain, periods of chaos and destruction. It's hard to imagine anyone prioritizing the preservation of delicate drawings during those times. The fact that any survived, let alone hundreds, is astounding. It shows that they must have been valued in some way, even if that value wasn't always what we would consider artistic today.
Right. It shows how important those pieces of paper must have been, even if their perceived value changed over time. And speaking of their journey through history, some of the drawings actually have marks that tell us about who owned them over the centuries.
Yeah, some of them have a Russian P with a crown on top. This means they were part of the personal collection of Catherine the Great's son. It reminds us that the Hermitage Museum wasn't open to the public until 1852. Before that, huge art collections were often the private domain of the monarchy. These marks give us a direct link to the people who saw the value in these drawings and ensured that they were kept safe.
And to bring things full circle, the lecture even included a 16th century copy of a drawing by Hieronymus Bosch. The original was from the late 15th century.
Right.
This proves that people were still making copies for all sorts of reasons in the century that followed.
And what's really cool about this example is that it shows Bosch's unique style, those fantastical figures and imaginative forms being copied. It shows how much of an impact his work had, even if this particular copy was made by someone else, maybe to learn his techniques or just to have a record of his amazing creations.
So as we wrap things up, let's go back to that initial thought. Thinking about these 15th century drawings as cookies, as vessels of information about their time, it gives us a new way to appreciate them, don't you think?
Totally. We're not just admiring them for being pretty, we're seeing the incredible amount of data they hold.
Exactly. We've seen how they reveal unexpected things about artistic practices, social structures, even the basic materials used in their creation, like the type of cert used for ink. And then there's that whole fascinating story of how these fragile objects were collected and saved over centuries. It all adds so much depth to our understanding. It goes way beyond simply appreciating them as art.
It really does.
And for our listeners, we hope this has given you some food for thought, some aha moments. by showing how a modern concept can shed light on the past in surprising ways. It reminds us that seemingly unrelated things can be connected when we think about how functions and meanings evolve.
And it makes me wonder, if we think about our own digital cookies today, all the data they collect and how that data is analyzed, what will future generations learn about us from those tiny digital traces we leave behind?
That's an incredible thought, and something for all of us to ponder as we navigate this digital age.
I agree. It's fascinating.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.